Hi, my name is Parvini. I'm a design and technical director based out of Los Angeles, California. I've been doing this this general body of work for probably about the past 15 years or so, and been a 3D artist at some level since about 2010, specifically Cinema 4D. It was my first real major foray into 3D in general after being just kind of an AE comper for the most part of my early days. Let's take a look at kind of a somewhat recent reel, and then we can kind of dive into some hopefully fun stuff to talk about today. So after, probably working in 3D for the better part of 6 years or so, all these really cool GPU renders came out. There was Octane, Redshift was not far afterwards, and just things got faster and faster and faster and faster, and it was really cool because we could render anything. It was a really fun moment because all these kind of struggles that you'd kind of had early on in 3D work of waiting overnight for renders and hoping that there'd be no GI flicker, all this kind of old grandpa gray hair stuff, was all gone. New problems, but largely gone. And there was this ability to render stuff that you saw these big studios making, and that was really, really cool. And then for me, I kind of started getting bored doing it, and I don't know if it's just because I don't know if there's maybe an undiagnosed ADD, or I just like making things hard for myself. But I kind of went and started realizing that I was just kind of falling out of love with 3D in a kind of a certain degree. There's still so much to do. I still don't know what I'm doing, but I was kind of looking for inspiration, where I wanted to go to next. I wasn't really doing glitches, I wasn't doing a whole bunch of different things that I was starting to rule out what I didn't want to do. And then I had this really cool opportunity to jump into a project with Adult Swim, and this group that would end up becoming an incredibly fun group to be part of, BMO. And the show was Dream Corp LLC. It's a really rad show, a ton of creative liberty that we were given, and a ton of insane constraints. The show was based around this vector work that came from the guys who had worked on Scanner Darkly, and it was all this automation, and there was no specular, and all of a sudden, I kind of got back to this almost like art school kind of game of okay, what do I, can I make a good looking image if I don't have, reflections and GI bounce and this, that, and the other, and can you make something that looks interesting? Can you make something that looks like it matches everything else? And it was an incredible wormhole that we spent kind of diving down into for the better part of for about 3 years or so. And I've talked about it at some length in previous talks with Maxon, because cinema was a huge, huge part of that process of being able to help realize that world. And it did something really interesting for me at that time. It kind of rejuvenated my love and my roots as being a comic book fan, and someone who loved cartoon animation, and then all of a sudden you had found this kind of other place that had been left kind of dormant in the illustrative world. You have people like EJ who have done incredible work to help kind of create a vernacular and a great way to kind of jump in to sketch and tune and illustrative kind of works. But there's there's so many ways to do it. And that's what I think for me was really fascinating, was that I was back into a place where there wasn't a prescribed way to do something again. You could go back to experimentation, you could go back to treating software or mistreating software and get like a really interesting result out of it. And just being back in a place where there's no real rule of what was like the best way to do something. It was just what is the right solution for the look you're going for. And I want to take you through a couple different approaches that I've found as I've been trying for the past few years now to kind of regenerate the artist's hand and recreate a little bit of that analog inside of Cinema 4D. So not long after we'd kind of started getting a lot of momentum going with the Dreamcorp work, we actually had a really cool opportunity and were approached by FX to pitch on some of the campaign teaser spots for Mayans, which was really, really cool. And it was kind of, again, like a wide open brief, and we thought it was a nice opportunity to kind of go a little bit down the illustrative work and try some stuff that we hadn't really had a chance to play with before inside of the Dreamcorp kind of, art direction that we had been living through. Okay, well, what's the iconography? Well, let's look at like biker jackets, and you think it looks a certain way, and then it kind of looks something else. We kind of go around, and like tattoos actually end up becoming like a really, really great reference for us of being able to kind of dive through and just take a look at a lot of this kind of Mayan and South American kind of iconography that felt really rich, really kind of just tough and visceral, and and made of the right kind of stock that we wanted to kind of be coming from. And then from off of that, we then started being able to kind of search around and find an array of different artists that were also kind of exploring that realm, using ink, paints, and other form. And we're like, okay, cool. We think we have something here. The line quality, the weighting, the crunch, the tooth, the tenacity, the sharpness, like all the things we're now starting to kind of link up here. And we're like, we think we have good ingredients to feed our artists. So one of the things that was kind of interesting with the Mayans project was it was the first time working with a client. We'd never worked with effects before, so we didn't really know exactly what the feedback flow was going to be and how symptomatic it was going to be for like hard changes. And that's a scary thing for a small studio when we're trying to approach the idea of doing a really 2D cell look for something, of like drawing over things and all this kind of painterly stuff, because it's kind of finite. Like once you've done it, you've done it, and then you gotta ask the animator to go back and do it again if someone decides at the last minute, I'm not into it. And so that kind of got built into the approach. I mean, we've kind of gotten all this way on kind of a lot of kit bash style approaches when we're in 3D, right? Like, don't worry about modeling the building in the background. Don't worry about handling this, as far as like a artisanal, individually built element for things that, sometimes aren't important. And sometimes when they are important, you still can rely on a kit bash to bring things together and help kind of finish out a scene. And so we were like, what if we tried doing that with cell and with animation? Then of course, not going out and buying a pack, but instead bringing in illustrators and bringing in artists that could help, finish out and kind of help build out this kit that we could basically start pulling from and kind of turn cinema almost more into a composite engine in some ways. How could we hang animation that was a more evergreen ask and element from our side onto the footage, onto the animations that we were trying to do, so that way if we need to pivot something, it wasn't asking the artist, hey, we've changed our camera angle, or this is looking a little bit different, can you please adjust 10 pixels up so it lines up the right way, or avoiding nasty After Effects mesh warping kind of stuff that can get horrific very, very fast. So it made sense, okay, let's try to build ourselves a toolkit of evergreen assets. And that was kind of that was kind of the goal set. And with that being said, we had to kind of like figure out good ways to do it. So if it was, polygon mountings onto simple planes, so we could use that with hair systems, or if it was just, tracing over renders that we would give to the illustrator, say, hey, just draw on this isometric view and let me reproject that back on. Again, each one of these things we could talk on for its own talk altogether. The goal here is to kind of talk about the approach style and the logic that we were applying in order to kind of execute on a certain look. So you can see here that I have a small handful of feathers, and I'd gotten those from our illustrator, Scott Hassel, who worked with us on Dream Corp, and is kind of like our usual first guy we bring in when we're trying to kind of, start collecting illustrative work, because he gets how broken we are. So usually what I do is I try with this stuff to kind of just build out, bring everything in, build it in, get it set up a way in which, I can tweak the colors, I can tweak all this stuff. And I started mounting them all into these cards. And then, you can kind of see here that I have a very simple sweep that's being driven by a tracer. I have another illustration that he's done that's given us kind of the wrapping, or essentially the pattern for the snake itself. At the head here, I have a quick ZBrush sculpt that I had done and had handed off a illustration or handed off a render over to Scott to do a illustration from the front top side. So that way then I could then go take those, project them, take that projection, and kind of get that, devved back into here. You kind of see that the geo is just a bit of a disaster. So I had to go through and basically create these little poly sweeps so that I can mount these feathers to. And they're really simple, nothing too crazy or complicated about them. This is just a simple set of planes, and we're sourcing that into the hair system, and that allows us to kind of just scatter these dynamic feathers essentially without having to worry about feather dynamics, which if you've dealt with that before, it can be a bit of a nightmare, and they definitely don't lend themselves to looking illustrative. So having the asset here really helped us a lot, and I went through and I did all kinds of fun, cute stuff, like rigging the eyes and got the mouth kind of set up here in this fun way. It really looks kind of like a T-Rex here, doesn't it? I even made this tongue. Really fun little thing. Took me way too long to do in retrospect, and ultimately, this whole build here actually didn't even make the final cut, but this was my favorite. I did so many rounds with this thing that this is the one I kind of wanted to show off, because honestly, this was my favorite child of the group. Looping back around though, you can kind of see in the diffusion here, I'm mixing a couple different elements, and you can see Scott's work is present. This is the resulting bake out of those illustrations that he had done. And so again, just without much, we're already getting a nice illustrated look, because we're just mounting these kind of custom drawings back onto the 3D without having to get in Substance or anything else, because I just didn't have time, nor did I have the resources to do that. I have a little simple poly sweep here that I have run down the back, and that would allow me to then go through and kind of mount on these feathers onto the back and kind of tussle them around a little bit, but you can kind of see it's adding a lot of really fun detail really quickly. And again, we're trying to think about this in the way that a illustrator or an artist would think about it. So you're not going to have like a whole lot of rogue stuff. They're going to want to, there's going to be kind of like a method to the madness. So really trying to kind of keep these really well manicured locations that the feathers would be showing up at, and it all feeling really intentional again through the whole process. So cool, I have a pretty good build here that I'm happy enough with. Now it comes to animating this, and if you've ever animated a snake, it's not really all that fun when you get into the kind of crazy IK and having to rig that all up, especially if you're doing a custom build. So my favorite cheat in these scenarios is to go through and start plopping in a whole bunch of nulls. I'm going to try to be a good little artist here and try to name this, but I have plenty of projects that I have not. So you can kind of see, kind of go through, and I have these big kind of handles on there, and you'll understand why in a second. I'm just going to kind of drag and place these around. Cool. Let's say that that's a really cool look. Just pretend for a second. I'm grab the tracer. I'm going to go over, grab these nulls, toss them inside. Again, just kind of general good housekeeping. I'm going to say connect all of them. Great. Now we have a nice little constellation going on. I'm going to go through and make it a B-spline, and I'm going to add some extra points to the spline. Now we got a nice kind of organic form that's going on here, but the best part again is that it's kind of a pretty procedural build, so I can kind of just go grab this guy, swing him around. We're not worrying about playing with Beziers or pose morphs to the points. It's, you know, all very tangible and kind of working like a bit like a marionette or like a toy of some kind, which ultimately for someone like me is like the best way to be able to have it. You know, you know, getting too lost in the rig can get a little bit messy. I'm going to go through and kind of color code this, because again, when you have a scene and you start getting too many of these kind of rig elements showing up, it can get really confusing really fast. So color coding everything together is a really kind of time-saving workflow, just to understand, like, am I grabbing the right darn thing? So we go through here, toss them into the null so we can kind of keep track of where everything's supposed to be at. Again, try to, you know, do some nice naming conventions that at least make sense to me. And now I have this setup here that I can now think about, well, what if I take it and toss it onto a spline wrap? Find it here fast. There we go. And I can tell you right now, it's probably gonna be a little bit off, but let's just kind of just see how bad this is. Perfect, just a little bad. So you can see that we're offset just a little bit off of our source spline, and that's because you can see that arrow that's running through the whole thing is kind of a little shifted up. So I'm going to flip the directionality of it, and I'm going to offset this, offset that, and perfect. Okay, now we're running along the actual rail that we needed. That's great. That works for me. And so you can see, again, not really rocket science. I've got a snake. The snake lives on a wire. Perfect. So now I'm already getting somewhere where I can start now posing this thing and kind of getting myself into a better art direction kind of position where I can just say, well, I want him to be banking like this, or maybe banking like that. There you go. Yeah. And again, everything still works. We haven't reset anything. The geo's still pretty dynamic now because it's just working off the, you know, the mesh or the spline wrap. So if I need to update the geo, it's not really a big deal. Now, again, just trying to think about this in a way that isn't going to be like a reweighting issue. I'm going to drag my feathers, or actually drag the mesh, the spline wrap over, because I was basically doing a double set here where it was spline wrapping the feathers that were already on a spline wrapped item, so it's kind of like a recursive aspect. So again, keep your nulls in the right hierarchical order to make sure that you're kind of corralling where the areas of effects are happening at. But cool, I have the feathers, they've mounted onto to those little sweeps. I have my snake, and I have my feathers, and it's all there now, and it's kind of ready for posing and ready for action a little bit. I'm going to go through here real fast, and now I'm going to add some of our stock elements, quote unquote, that we got from our animation team. I'm going to kind of tighten this down, so now he's kind of in this kind of bulbous, you know, neck shape kind of thing here. I'm just going to kind of go through and try to just build this material out kind of soup to nuts, so you can kind of just see the process that you go through. So turn that off because we don't really need reflection on this. I'm going to go over and I'm going to find my PNG sequence that I got from my animation team, go through, loop, detect, great. My little squiggly thing that's going to show up. This is all fine for now. I'm going to control drag this over so now those colors show up also in the color channel, so I can kind of get a better sense of what things are looking like. And I can't really tell what I'm looking at right now, so I'm going to over here, bump up the resolution that it's going to be displaying at the viewport. That's a little bit better. I can kind of better tell what's going on. But now let's just try to work on the orientation of the turtleneck that I put over the snake. Let's kind of orient that around a little bit. Let's kind of just have it travel a little bit, so there's a bit of a twist that's happening. It's always a good kind of first step for me. And cool. All right, that's relatively rad. That's great. So really quickly now, again, we've managed to kind of get this like, little animated illustrated element that's just already mounted to the object itself. I can now go through, tweak it. I can sample out different texture sets. One thing I do like to do though is I like to kind of get in there and do a little bit of displacement. That's not what I want at all. Let's bring that down a little bit. Let's calm it down. Okay, yeah, see, this is a little bit better. So now we're getting a little bit of thickness going on, because what you don't want to do is have that cell just flatten out completely and kind of reveal the polygons that are happening. And I don't want to get into some crazy volumetric kind of thing. So this is really good. It cheats just enough so that way it never kind of clips to that totally flat like kind of thing that would happen with like After Effects where you look too far at the 2.5D. And so now we're being able to, again, generate the displacement off of the animation itself. I'm going to do a tiny, tiny little blur that I found out would be kind of necessary with this stuff. And it helps get rid of some of the jaggies because obviously this was not made to be a displacement map. It's not bad. Okay, cool. So now we're getting like a tiniest bit of rounding that's happening, so it feels like there's a little bit of puffiness that's there. But now we get a little bit of aliasing that shows up. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to toss my texture into a posterize, and I'm going to go over and kind of set a couple steps here. Perfect. So see how that just clipped out a lot of that kind of aliasing detail? Now we have a lot more sharp kind of intentional lines where, again, we're trying to hide the fact that we're doing this in CG. You want it to feel like someone drew this as much as possible. And again, by having it where you have kind of only two artists involved drawing all of the textures, things start matching really, really nicely. You have this like really kind of graphic look, and you kind of fit the spine. I'll just keep the light. So now as we kind of go through, I can now offset this, and now I've built this kind of cool snake roller coaster thing, and it's going to make it really easy to animate. I'm going to go through, grab that, go here, grab that, bump that up. Cool. Just make sure it's all looking right. I'll toss this in the right kind of hierarchical order here, just because it's going to make my life a little bit easier. And let's just make a quick preview here. Set some numbers so we get a decent enough resolution to see what we're looking at. All right, good. Perfect. Now, while this is kind of pressing through, one thing that's like a really good call out here is by working to this kind of singular line, we're also getting away from like the weird kind of too much detail aspect that you can get into like when you're trying to get into rigs, by having just this like really clean, simple spline that works to kind of a more graphic nature. So again, like we're trying to keep things in these like essentialist manners, and really just trying to find moments that we can get away from any extra detail that we really don't need to have in there. Or we can flip the actual texture itself so it's going a different direction. So it just feels like it should be kind of peeling off as he's moving forward in space. Twist that around a little bit. Just help kind of bumps up that amount of kind of banking and torque that's happening on that texture as it wraps around him. But now we have like a little like mini kind of cell rig, and if I want to go through and I can kind of keep messing with a lot of these settings here, kind of like that, like that. See, so now I have a couple of these guys rolling, and they're all crawling over them, and they're all centralized to this one singular texture. It just makes it really easy to start now sampling what you've done. It's pretty light in the scene. I'm still being able to navigate in a nice way. and it's all amounted to, at this point, kind of a single texture. And again, it all is still based on that initial, tracer rig, and this is starting to kind of feel pretty cool. I have lots of notes, but with enough time, I can get some of the stuff kind of tuned in. We can kind of see, like, it feels intentional. It feels like someone actually may have actually drawn this. The details that are there, what's getting called out. And remember, there's no lighting in this either. We're just looking at kind of a flat graphic. So what I'm doing right now here is I'm tossing in a little displacement effector just to kind of help create a little irregularity with the smoke itself, or this fleshy thing, just so it's not just so perfectly mounted to him. If you can get a little extra travel, a little extra move around that's happening, just helps kind of sell the cell, a little bit here, where it's not, you just don't want to ever feel the geometry. I think is the biggest thing for me. You don't want to feel where it's coming from too much. Now if I actually bring in a light, it starts actually kind of creating some new and kind of different opportunities. And I'm not going to rebuild all the materials here, but you can kind of see that for the smoke that I've brought in, I'm going to kind of tweak a couple of these settings here. So, as usual, go over kind of the ordinaire, broaden that out a little bit, go over my luminance, multiply. I'm just going to kind of choose a color here. So again, now we're starting to be able to kind of play around a little bit with where is lit, what is the kind of the underlit side look like. And yeah, at this point it's kind of playtime. But again, it's one element. But we've established a look. We have an understanding of how to approach it. It's easy to deal with. It's not going to kind of rip us to the ground. And I can hand this off now to an artist and give this to them to animate. And the rig isn't so delicate that it's going to just be absurd for them to try to deal with. So then you just kind of keep doing this and keep doing this and keep doing this. And we kind of kept building out all these different pieces. And as they all kind of come together and you bring in the composite and you bring in the tracking and you're mounting to different objects, you start getting something. It starts to kind of become this connective tissue. And it eventually becomes a spot.
La sangre
es la sangre.
But yeah, it was a really fast turnaround, and we managed to get through it and made up as we went along. But then at some level, it kind of felt like we were cheating a little bit, where I was just ripping all these other people's work, and I wasn't really generating our look. What do I still want to do? And there's all these conversations that we had kind of started with Dream Corp that I'm re-falling in love with Mike Mignola's work and Bill Pope and all these just incredible comic artists and illustrators and painters. And I'm not tapping them yet. I want to really chase them down in a more direct path. And we were so incredibly fortunate that a friend of the studios, Scott, who runs Substance, reached out to us and invited us to be part of the 2020 TEDx opening sequence. And it was an incredible opportunity. We were so excited, nervous, scared, excited, nervous, scared, and kind of in that loop for a little while, especially as the list of who else would be working along with us showed up, because he was basically building this really kind of fun, exquisite corpse where each group would get a different prompt. And he kind of set up these sandboxes in a really fun way where each group was able to kind of choose the topic that they wanted to explore in some visual metaphorical aspect. So for us, in the middle of, at that point, like, COVID's, kind of rearing its ugly head, and all these things are changing in the world, and everyone's trying to figure out like what to do. The one that jumped out to us was the topic of choice, which felt like a really fun place to be, because it didn't feel as like technically like current as like some of the other topics or things that felt like it would really ask us to be kind of in different look styles than where we wanted to be. Choice gave us choice. And so we went through, concepted a bunch of different notions, and really kind of ended up circling in on this idea of like archetypes, of like all the voices in your head and all of the people in you that help make you who you are. And so with that, we were kind of looking at this like tarot style approach of archetypes, where you have all of these versions of you that kind of flourish out at different points in time, because we wanted to kind of dig into it a little further with character design. We wanted to explore a little bit of like that kind of core character animation. I had always been doing everything through mocap at that point, so I kind of wanted to go a little more kind of organic on that, where I'm in there and I'm doing like the hand kind of keyframe animation and really trying to drive that through, along with like from soup to nuts character design, and like really like trying to be intentional and thoughtful of like, what are we going to make? We don't want to make something that looks like anything that the rest of the group is going to be doing, but we also want to feel like we're showing up, and we really wanted to like pay the respect that this project deserved. I mean, Scott's been killing it for years on the TEDx projects, and and having all of these contemporaries showing up who are known for 2D and kind of 3D animation in this kind of illustrative look, we just didn't want to look silly. So it's a good opportunity to kind of get back down to the basics, get back down to kind of like the sketchboard again, and go back into a little bit of the art theory, where we started kind of being like, okay, well, what do we want to look at? And it's going to come down to this character. So of course I rip out all my Mignolo, references, and we start pulling out all these like different kind of illustration styles that we've like really, really liked. These like strong, poppy, graphic, and ugly kind of looks to a certain degree. Like they're not like beautiful. They're like, there's a visceral element to all of them. And we knew that we wanted to have a female character. Just felt tonally right at the time to like have like a female protagonist in this. And so that allowed us to kind of like go through and kind of start talking about like shape, form, and the ratio, the kind of the size and shape ratios, color palettes, and things like that. And it really allowed me to kind of like break open like all of these like notes that I've been taking on the Mignola work specifically, because when you look at this one, at the character of like Hellboy, let's say for example, or even like what they did with Spider-Verse and the Spider-Man character, there is this really interesting kind of study that you could do of like, okay, well, this is how it was drawn and this is how they modeled, right? How do they carry that tone of the illustration over into the sculpting aspect of it that kept that feeling, that felt, that made you love the drawing in the first place. So like, as you can see over here on the left with the Hellboy sculpt, like he still is retaining that size and shape and proportionality. It could be drawn actually, like when you're looking at it. Same way with the Peter Parker in the bottom right, and Mr. Bruce up there, kind of popping out from behind him. Like they all were retaining the same negative space and kind of contour when you kind of clock it as a shape as the original illustrations do. So when you're thinking about this like volumizing of the character, you want to kind of retain that illustration quality that you would like so much to kind of begin with. And so, understanding like, okay, well, where are my kind of clear guidelines? Where are the weights and mass? Where is the light pooling? So you want to kind of have these like oversimplified areas that can kind of catch light and retain it. And I tried to kind of bring that over into these kind of like really like rough, ugly sketches for this girl that, again, these kind of exaggerated features, these like kind of long limbs, but, not, really wanted to try to kind of like play down the body shape a little bit here and just have it be more about, her and kind of exploring this kind of neutral territory that she would be existing in, because from her, we had to basically plop out this mapping for all of these other versions of her. So she was too arced in any one direction. She was too cool, too mean, too nice, too pretty, too anything. It wouldn't work because we all of a sudden, like, the other flavors that we were trying to push her over towards wouldn't quite make sense. So we had to kind of like have this really good like central ground to work from. And the first one that I went towards, just because of probably personal tone and taste, was this rebel look, which was kind of like, the badass that like comes out, at the right times. And so again, same geo. The geo was never going to change with her. It was all going to just be about the paint jobs changing. So changed her hairdo, I gave, a little bit, gave her a different kind of demeanor on like how the kind of the facial kind of sculpt was looking. So I was doing stuff with pose morphs to kind of change some of the facial configuration, but never like the actual geo proportions themselves. Just, a frown or a smile, how fast like the lighting fall off was working. And it was this really like rewarding process of getting through each one of them. It was so much fun. I mean, it was one of those things where like, I was like, well, I can keep making characters. And Herzl, who was working with me, was like, I think we have enough. And I was like, okay, well, I guess. And then once we have all these characters and we're feeling confident about them, we feel like, they're rigged up, they're ready to go, we're ready to dance. And then we're talking about like where they're going to be planted, what they're going to be in front of. And you realize in that scenario really quickly that the environment is also a character. That if you don't pair this properly, it's not going to look right. So you're trying to kind of like find this shape and form and, kind of visual language that wants to speak with the character style. So again, we're doing these kind of like, asymmetrical, blocky, kind of elongated, dramatic ratios. And we're trying to kind of think about that in relationship back over to the characters and like how do these things kind of play across. We're noticing a couple things that are starting to come out for like our really core things that we want, which is simple, recognizable, silhouettes and these kind of broad stroke fills. So I go in, and this is my first time, hopping into Arnold. I want to teach myself the Arnold Toon Shader just to get a sense of it. So I'm going through and I start kind of like trying to sculpt things in that same kind of intentional fashion. We're using hatchings and these different kind of play elements, but we're trying to, again, sculpt the geo in the same fashion that I had sculpted the character. So that way everything felt like it was all kind of part of the same tone. And once we got there, like everything started kind of working together in a really, really nice way. But there's so many things that go into this that could, again, be its own talk altogether. When we talk about things like where the camera is, different camera tricks, ratios, comping tricks, like there's all these tools that we kind of broke out, but it did come down to the core assets and elements themselves all feeling like they spoke together in a really good way, and it made everything else so much easier to do. And just little by little, layer by layer, you kind of worked through and got it all. But I want to, again, go back down to just making sure that the asset itself is kind of speaking in this intentional, illustrative style. Because I think that the material sets and how we approach building the palettes is a big part of this. So I'm going to take us again here kind of from start to finish on trying to kind of just build out this look. Now, we're not in Arnold this time. We're in standard renderer, and we're just going to use the default cinema package to kind of build this out. And I'm in here and I'm going to fix the fong so I'm not getting any extra weird roundings. And I'm in using the fall off shader, which is a big tool for me, because it's a really great way to clock and see, where is the shadow pool happening at, where is the, where do the highlights want to kind of exist at, just based upon like the core nature of the sculpt. But you can see with this that by having these kind of broad areas where there's not much information being caught, and then there's like really like kind of high frequency, tight, kind of greebly, rocky, nodularly kind of nasty corners here. You're getting this like really nice contrast between the two styles of kind of look. And so then I'm going to pop this in front of a color real fast, and it just kind of gives us a nice way to be able to say, okay, I see the shape, I see the highlight, I see the shadow. And now I get to start playing and tuning how much of each I want. Like, you know, where do I want that fall off to kind of happen at? And so I'm working here with just the y-axis. So everything on going kind of downward facing goes to black on this like really sharp fall off. And my usual thing is I just like to have kind of sharp, crisp edges with this, because for me, I feel like it always helps the kind of the intentionality. And I'm in a fusion shader right now, and this is actually a Tim trick from Hello Lux, where if you're in the fusion shader, you can actually be getting like the lifetime in viewport updates. So if you don't have 15 layers to be going through, you just have to kind of two things that you're trying to kind of A/B on top of. You can kind of mix these things together and be able to just keep track of everything and not have any kind of mystical elements of like, oh, on render it looks like a certain way. I can kind of do the look dev in viewport. And you can see here, like, this is already kind of getting a cool look to it. Like, we have kind of the broad strokes and some of this extra information that's showing up. And as I'm kind of dropping that down, now it kind of feels like a secondary read, which is a big thing for me. Like, I like having kind of the first clock of like the shape of something, the general understanding of it, of where its kind of shadows and highlights are, and then having a little bit of extra information for someone to look at if they want to lean in. But we want to be careful with this, because you can see as I'm tightening this up a little bit, it starts getting a little too detailed. You get this kind of moire kind of look, and now it's looking digital again. Like, no artist would spend the time doing that many hatches. You want to kind of keep it a little more clumsy. So I'm just kind of working through here a little bit, and it's okay. It's not bad. We're losing some dimension right now with this, and I just don't think my mapping is right. Oh, no, it's not. All right, so I'm gonna over in UV, swing this over, I'm gonna bring this down. Cool, so now this is where how my UV is kind of orienting itself, and you can see like now like the wrapping is kind of a little more predictable for what you think you'd be mapping this as. Cool, that's a little bit better. So now I'm just gonna kind of play around with the scale of the dot shader, kind of work on my fall off here, like how quickly does it go from lightness to darkness, and that kind of hatching style that's going on here. Fix my aliasing here, anti-aliasing, because it just helps to kind of clean this up and make it feel a little more, what you're actually going to see. And as I play with kind of my fall-offs, again, this is all just kind of noodling around a little bit, and this is going to be a case-by-case scenario based upon your geo, based upon your lighting setups of like, how aggressively do you need to drive these values? And I'll spend way too long in that one little shader graph there. You kind of see, like, as I'm bringing this in though a little bit, like we're getting a nice kind of second read to this. And the other thing that I want to play with, and this is something that's actually been a little more recent for me, is starting to actually bring the specular back in. I didn't use specular for a long time with a lot of my tune shading, but if you take that and we start throttling it with the the dots here, we start getting a little bit of that like Spider-Verse-y kind of halftone that starts showing up, which is kind of a fun look. And if I wanted to get like really complex here, I could take this, put it inside of a projector effector, and like tell it set it to flat, and then we start getting like a little bit more of that like Chad Ashley style Spider-Verse tutorial that he had done, which is super useful, by the way. Even if you're not using Arnold, just seeing how he kind of went through and approached the process was a really informative little workflow tidbit. Yeah, just watch everyone, steal from everyone, and just make sure that you're ripping it off well enough to make it your own. You kind of see as I'm playing around here, though, I'm being able to kind of get these, again, procedural looks that, are based upon the lighting and the kind of angles here. And so as I'll move my camera around in a second, I'll kind of be able to dictate this. I'm just not quite feeling quite right now. No, that's not right. Yeah, I need to flip this around. But you can see though, like, we're keeping that kind of inky look to all this. It feels like now we're playing with kind of the underpaint and this kind of fine layer of detail that isn't really the main thing you're looking at. It's more of this kind of secondary thing. I think I'm just going to throttle all this back quite a bit, honestly. Let's put this back. I think that's better than it was before. Yeah. That's a little better. See, so now we're getting this kind of nice breakup that's starting to happen around kind of the shadowy corner areas. And I could keep working on this and tightening it up a little bit more and more and more to make sure that every single one of those edges is really firing and hitting at the right stride. But you can kind of get a nice sense now where it's it feels like the areas that I'm highlighting would be the areas that an artist would highlight, right? This kind of, these broad areas are now pooling and collecting light in a nice way. We're getting these sharp handoffs into shadow. You get a really clear sense of where the contours are kind of living and existing from. And it just has a really nice kind of graphic feel to it right now. And again, we're still in viewport. We haven't done any comping yet. Man, that dot patterns. I could be here all day working on that. No, it's not bad though. So the next thing I'm going to do here is, I feel like I want to up this kind of highlighting aspect. So I use the Fresnel a lot for this kind of stuff, where basically what I'm going to do is set kind of this persistent edge light that always exists, and it's not linked to any of the lights in the scene, and it really helps the viewer kind of have this clocking of I know where the top of this thing always is. If you can have almost this roof line of lighting, it'll give you this kind of contour hit that is independent of a lot of the lighting setups, where they always feel they kind of get a sense of oh, okay, that's the top of it. There's some light source somewhere that's hitting this thing. And I'm breaking this up a little bit with a bump, just to see if I can kind of get that to feel like it's handing off in just the tiniest bit of a dry brush kind of feel. But even as I'm looking at this now, some of the shading feels a little soft for me, and I feel like I would probably keep clipping this even harder. And I might do some of that in comp too, of just throttling some of the levels. But you can see we now have a procedural material set that, as we kind of move our light around and as we kind of just keep tinkering with some of this, and I'm going to bump the contrast of my light here a little bit because that helps with the fall off, because I just really contrasty stuff, I think, just generally speaking. We're getting this nice kind of graphic look, and we'll do bonus points here if I go through and set this up and start giving this thing color. And now we're getting, again, we can start kind of playing with it and just playing with kind of bolder looks, but it's all keeping it with that kind of core context of just keeping that kind of under ink, this idea of kind of this ink pass, and then a little bit of this this wash over kind of fill in. And again, this is just kind of one element that we're playing with. And we're just trying to kind of establish this method of shading and method of how shadows work. So that way, if I have the rock that looks like this, and then I have the tree that has a similar set of kind of pooling shadows, it'll help just connect everything. Now, one little bonus trick that I'm going to do here is one that I kind of do from time to time. And I'm going to go in, I'm going to throw in my favorite displacement effector, and I'm going to kind of just bloat this guy out a little bit. So now he's looking a little swollen, right? It's a little bulbous. Kind of over crank some of the lighting setups here. I'm working here now in the Fresnel. So what this is going to do for me is I'm going to say I only want to see the edges of this thing that are kind of extending out and sitting just out and away a little bit from the geo itself. And it's almost kind of like a fake sketch and tune a little bit, but it feels like you're doing it with like a thicker kind of marker. And I'm going to go in now and change this over to a noise, because that's going to break it up a little bit, so that way it's not too matchy-matchy. You want to make it feel like it's not the exact same pass of the hand that's doing it. This isn't quite right, no. Let's see here. Take that. Go here. Does here fall off instead, actually, so I can get a little bit of the top and a little bit of this front facing kind of mixing to give me an angle of this thing that's going to be doing this. That's kind of interesting now. So now the geo is only showing up at kind of this like ratio, but again, it's kind of extending out. It feels kind of now like an underpainting that's existing there, and it's helping break up the form a little bit, so it doesn't feel so perfect and doesn't feel so like just consistent at all times, at all angles. And as we'll rotate this around, because we're doing things that are kind of camera-based effects, it's going to be constantly updating. So then if you hit this with kind of a posterization of time or something like that, you'll start getting this like nice kind of flutter that starts really happening in a good way. You can kind of see, like, again, so now I'm just kind of being able to art direct and drive this around. Nice. Okay. Yeah, that's feeling cool. Yeah, so like now I've kind of gone through here and I've managed to kind of now create this like second like area that like light and information can kind of get caught or throttled on. And so it helps with kind of the underpainting style feel. We're getting some happy accidents that are showing up. And it's feeling intentional. And that's always the goal here. So like as I kind of go through it, okay, if I want to color to the kind of the scene environment or something else. But it's kind of fun. So yeah, so you can kind of see here just how we're being able to kind of drive all this in. Again, we have no plugins that we're using. We're not using any special, texture packs or anything. This is just built-in cinema with its built-in shaders using stuff that's been around for years. And it's just taking a little bit of time to sit and just think about what we're trying to show, how we want it to look, and just kind of keeping that kind of graphic intentionality present and ready inside of the piece itself. So with enough time and enough effort in getting all these kind of different pieces sorted out, the piece finally kind of came together in this like really inspiring way for us. We're really proud of it. We're so incredibly, honored to have been invited to be part of this thing that, just be able to put something out there that we felt like maybe looked maybe just the tiniest bit different than what else was being put out there, was enough motivation for us to really try to dig deep and just deliver on a promise of just trying to do our best to, create a little bit of a visceral moment, and explore a look that hopefully wasn't one that felt, too specifically kind of run over. And yeah, this is kind of how it turned out. So then there's this element of like, yay, we did it. Where do we go from here? And honestly, that's kind of the coolest part for me right now, is I feel like I'm just now scratching the surface of where this can go. And as things are starting to kind of become a little more predictable in terms of like how these shaders will react, how, what the requirements of the geo are in terms of getting certain kind of looks out of it, the different animation styles and how they play into these things, like all these things are all starting to kind of activate at once. And I wanted to kind of take this then away from a lot of the commercial work for a second, just to have a chance to think, because the Substance project for TEDx was a really amazing moment to kind of get away from product work of like, how does this look with a shoe next to it? How does it look, with a hero actor in it? All these client-facing constraints. And I was like, I just want to keep digging in here and just seeing how this thing works in order to better understand where I think it could go and what it could potentially pair well with. And so, there wasn't really much better opportunity to do something as far as motivating yourself to do some work for yourself than, the recent explosion of the kind of the NFT scene. You can make something and someone likes something, and you get to make a couple bucks off it. It's great motivation to keep making it, right? Or not. But it was a really cool way to say, okay, I'm going to approach this almost in a fine art manner, and I want to start doing little mini paintings. I want to start doing little mini pieces that kind of are exploring these different topics as I kind of continue to kind of grope my way through this and figure out some of the different techniques and where they work and where they fail, and just keep refining this process over and over and over again to a certain degree. And the coolest part about that is that allows me to kind of, by walking away from client-facing work and just doing something that I'm inspired to do for a few seconds, you get to kind of look back around and say, okay, cool. Who are all these artists now that I want to do work that I feel like speaks to their work, or these bodies of work that like you wish you could kind of be like having your work kind of sitting next to a certain degree. And that's the most amazing part, is like all of a sudden like the references have now started kind of flooding back in of like, oh, that's right, I wanted to kind of look at that piece, or wanted to do a double check on like the line quality styles of how this guy tends to build things out. And so you start being able to really kind of dig through and see all these different kind of functioning theories and approach styles, and have them all still feel like they're now like really within arm's reach. And it's so exciting because, as we've seen thus far here, are we going to use cloners for scales? Are we going to use hair for cables, broken UVs, and the dot shader, to create like interesting line work? Oh, I found a great new artist, and I love what they're doing with their proportions and the way that like the shapes fall in and out, and some of the kind of ephemeral aspects. And so I'm like, let's just start making something. And so I started with these kind of core sculpts, again, trying to go soup to nuts on it, where I just wanted to kind of just start playing with these animals. I was always a figurative artist, and so I wanted to kind of just start there, because I feel like it's a really nice way to kind of gauge and understand how the form is working and how things work in motion. So it kind of created these like little loops that I've been putting up on Foundation, just to force myself to kind of go through and continue to kind of look at pacing, palette, comping techniques, texture styles, trying to kind of recreate these like inspirational moments that I had like looking at artwork as a child, of like, can I make that stuff now? What's the best way to do it? How much can I handle inside of cinema? Do I have to default to After Effects for stuff? And just trying to keep as much as possible in vanilla cinema, because those constraints are actually like really creating some interesting learning experiences for me. So I'm going to take now a sculpt that I did in ZBrush and bring it over, and I kind of want to just walk through the shading techniques for this rabbit that I had done for this Horns of the Rabbit series that I had done recently. And the goal with the sculpt was to sculpt something that would respond well to the shader systems that we kind of were just playing with over with the TEDx. But again, just continuing to refine it, trying to get it in such a way where the light areas would kind of pool and collect where an artist would want them to pool, and shadows collect where you'd figure the shadows should collect. And it was an awesome moment because things kind of started working, and you can see really quickly here, just with a very basic setup, we're already getting a really graphic style, and it's all coming from the geo. So as much as we're talking about matte dev, what you're putting the geo, or what you're putting the materials on as far as the geo goes, really does matter. Like we can see here how like this pooling is already kind of working for us in being able to kind of get these like really kind of graphic looks pretty quickly, but it's not working from all angles quite yet. So this is really where the rest of kind of the toon shader systems kind of come into play here. So we're going to go back over to our favorite little dot shader and just kind of take a look at this here. Switch away from camera, go over to lights, always working with lights, because I always want that information from the lighting direction to be kind of guiding how the dots are kind of moving off, because again, you're trying to always create that intentionality. You can kind of see here though that like it's a little too tight, it's a little too perfect, and no one would spend the time shading those areas in that ratio. So this is that fine line moment that we were actually at with the stone from the last piece, where you want it to kind of be large and clumsy enough to reflect the laziness of the artist's hand, and tight enough in the areas where you feel like the artist might go into like a slightly tighter greeble. Because one thing with this that we're trying to do, especially with this kind of dot shader pseudo hatch style setup, is we're trying to infer that there's detail there that I just don't care to draw. So you can see here, like by breaking up some of these edges, it's starting to feel like, okay, we're speaking a little bit to that fur. And rather than sitting there and like actually like cloning on a bunch of fur and having to deal with that, like we just want to just make the most subtle reference to there's something on the skin that is inconsistent, and that's a big Mignola thing, where it's like you'll get these broad areas, and then he'll kind of, he might break it up, or he might throw like a couple like little detail bumps in there to say, and his skin is actually really lumpy, but don't worry about that because that's not important for the understanding of the character. And so you're trying to get these like kind of spots where you feel like you're getting this like kind of nice painterly breakup, that speaks to kind of the general shapes and forms that are happening, and refers or infers a little bit of there's more detail here than what I'm willing to draw for you right now, but you can get a sense of what this thing's made of. And so there's this like kind of reductionist technique that you're kind of constantly keeping in hand of being very tactical and intentional about the details that I'm giving back to the audience, or the viewer, that they feel like they're intentional pieces of information that I'm giving to you in order to understand what you're looking at. Nothing more, nothing less, just enough. So as I'm kind of moving my light around here, you can kind of see we've got ourselves down to like a pretty nice kind of painty, kind of acrylic look going on right now, and none of like the like lumps or like volumetrics going on as far as like paint on surface, but that kind of graphic two-tone nature of it. So we go back into the fusion shader here, as I tend to like to do, And I'm going to go, and this time what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to bring in the hatch shader. Now the hatch shader is a tricky one. It took me a while to kind of get used to, but this one's basically lives and dies with what you feed it. So I have kind of collected this like whole like analog kind of collection of like brush strokes and things like that I've grabbed from all over the place. And I'm going to feed it one of these more dry brush kind of looks. And, so immediately you can kind of get a sense of what's happening. I'm going to take it away from the dark and put it over to the light strokes. Because what I'm asking it to do is I'm asking it to kind of pay attention to where the light's hitting it and put strokes there instead. And this isn't dense enough, though. I'm not getting enough coverage right now. So I'm going to kind of go through here and kind of tweak some settings. This is just kind of force of habit stuff, where I'm kind of increasing the frequency of the streaks. I'm allowing higher rotations and the UVs to kind of overlap themselves a little bit. And I'm going to kind of bump up the number of steps here because it'll help kind of fill in the gaps. But see, now we're starting to get this really nice kind of dry brush kind of aspect that's now making it feel like we did basically an underpaint of the light tones and then kind of recarved back in the black kind of inky elements of it. And so again, we're constantly trying to hide our hand of exactly like what thing is comped, what thing is 3D. We're just trying to keep the viewer guessing as much as possible with this. And I'm not totally sold on this quite yet, so I'm going to kind of tweak around this just a little bit. Just add a little bit more variation to this. And we're not even getting, I think, everything out of it that we could be. So let me just kind of work with the colors here a little bit. So you can see I'm working in the light palette to kind of set that. Put the threshold, and that kind of changes like how quickly we hand off, between each one of these like layer sets. But it's a little confusing because it's called a hatch shader, but in many ways it honestly feels a lot more like a cloner kind of scatter system than it does most anything else. I'm gonna grab this. I'm gonna bring this guy over here so that way he actually starts kind of informing the color channel, and just leave the dots over in the diffusion so that way that's driving what's light and dark. And then now in the color channel, I'm going to start getting a little more cute with actually my palettes. That's kind of rad. So now what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to kind of really like emphasize to the viewer this like undercoating that like there's like layers of color here that I've painted over time. So now we're getting these kind of like little pops of kind of this like fuchsia color that come through that are kind of just inferring like there's an undercoat here and I've intentionally painted over it, but I didn't do a great job at it. Like I didn't finish the job totally. There's a haphazardness, and again, it's kind of, clumsiness that happens in kind of the analog mediums and these imperfections, rather than it being like perfectly filled in all areas. I really want to try to push the fact that I didn't finish the job, to the viewer. And tossing a sky here is really, again, it's that trick, same from the rock, where I'm being able to kind of clock the overall silhouette and then where my light and shadow is pooling, right? Because when it was just on the black background, like that looked cool, but now I realize like, I don't know, my ratio may not be quite right, or I'm not light, not everything is showing itself the way that I'm really going to want it to. Like, yeah, cool. If I do like this nice Nike kind of, hard key, looks good. And in the shadows there, like, okay, cool. That's looking pretty good there. And that looks pretty good there, but you can feel that like, okay, cool. Yeah, see, we're going to lose the eye, and the artist would not lose the eye. And I don't want to have to hand paint that. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to toss a Fresnel here into the luminance of these like little glowy eyes I did. I'm going to choke that down. I'm going to pull that over so there's a little bit of feathering, but very subtle. And now I'm going to bring that and choke that back. And now I have this kind of perfect built-in kind of edging. So that way, no matter what the light's doing, I'm always going to get that little emphasis of like where the bottom eyelid is, because like while the brow looks like it's going to be pretty consistent for me a lot of the time, unless I'm doing like a hard side light, I'm going to kind of adjust this geo for the eye now and just kind of shift him around so that way we know we're going to be getting that bottom kind of eyelid lip. That's feeling better. So again, so now we're getting these kind of the spots that the artist would potentially color. I'm going to bring this little red matte here and just kind of see what happens with a pop of a color palette. Just, again, I'm cheating because it's, you know, basically black, white, and red, and everything looks good black, white, and red. Go through here. Now, one thing I want to call out is that with my lighting, I always like doing a hard shadow. It just, again, keeping everything intentional, keeping sharp fall off and sharp edges, it just really helps with the idea that, like, no, I wanted that there. You know, pushing that emphasis of, like, I intended for that thing to be there. And the next step I'm really going to take with this is I want to give you kind of a second read of the information on the sculpt, because we have more information than what we're really revealing. So as I go through here and I'm putting this now via the Fresnel and kind of driving this around, now you get to see all this extra information where, again, the artist would probably emphasize like where the foreleg is in front of the back, you know, in front of the back leg. We're getting kind of a nice chin highlight here, and you're kind of, the audience is being able to kind of follow the contour of the character a little bit better. And I don't know if white's necessarily like the way to do it here, but you can see now the second read. We have the silhouette, we have the highlight, the shadow, and now this extra information that we could start kind of getting in there as this like tertiary read. I don't really love how the light's falling off on the body though. I feel like we're kind of over choking that. I want to make sure that that hatch, or not the hatch, but the dot shaders giving me visually as much as it really could be. So I want to kind of work that as I'm bringing this in. And as I tighten and expand this gradient, that basically increases the contrast and how quickly we fall from like the highlight areas over to the shadow areas. I'm going to take this and bring that down so we're not getting so much shadow here. I'm going to just throw a little bit of color into that. That's not the way to do it. Just put it to more of a complementary color. There we go. So now we're getting this like little bit of like secondary information. We know that the feet aren't as important as the upper body. You know, you feel the notion of shadow. You feel that that area should be a little bit darker, but I still want to get the information over to the audience. So now really like the last thing that kind of jumps out at me is like how perfect this like, you know, now like ink work is that's showing up on the body. And this is another EJ trick where I'm going to go in and I'm going to toss in this like really tight high frequency noise to kind of break up that Fresnel that I put in there, just to kind of help reemphasize the fact that, like, oh, I'm using a dry brush, you know, mixed with inks as I'm kind of building the character shape. And this part's going to be kind of dialed based upon what your UV shapes are and, you know, general ratios, but you're going to want to have generally a very tight, contrasty noise with a very tiny, tiny bit of bump strength in there in order to kind of break that apart. Let me make that even smaller and see if that helps me out a little bit here. Yeah, see? Starting to kind of break it up a little bit. And again, this is more of a detail thing and something that you can kind of drive, but you know, we've given the viewer now a first read, second read, and now a third read almost, where it's like I get the general shape, I get the light and shadow, I understand where that is, and then for kind of close-ups and macros, we have this ability now for extra information, so I'm not so scared of like, oh, well, I have to make sure the light's hitting him at just this right angle, because if you can't see this part of the jaw, you don't know what the heck you're looking at. Like, that's now coming through via the Fresnel, and so that's almost like an easy pass a little bit as I come through. And I've color toned this over towards red because I kind of like doing that where I'll match whatever my environment scene style is to the actual highlighting edge. But yeah, that's kind of about it. From there, you just do a lot of animation, a lot of comping, don't sleep, and caffeinate yourself all the way through the end. But there's so much in this, and there's so many ways to explore the illustrative look in general. And it's been a fascinating experience for me to kind of go through, and it's been wildly gratifying, mostly because of the fact that it's just, there's not really a single way to do it. It's really about how you like to work. If you're if you like drawing, you can draw, you can scan it, you can bring it in, you can map it, and you can do kind of like the Kit Bash composite style that we did. If you are more of a mat dev person like I am, you can kind of go in and build these kind of procedural shaders, but you're always thinking about how best to hide which software you're in as you're doing it. You just never want to feel any package that you're making the piece in. So like, I don't want to feel the After Effects comping. I don't want to feel the Cinema 4D 3D-ness of it. Doing mixed frame rates is another enormous kind of conversation that we get into with comping, and this idea of like trying to create mixed media projects that feel this certain tension as if they almost want to fall apart, as if they haven't been made exactly precisely right, like getting away from the pitch perfect 24p 30 60 whatever, and having some stuff running 12, some 16, some 18, and getting these like different setups that like create this like tension with the viewer, that make them feel the analog, feel the creation of this in that kind of way, in the same way that's like even like old cartoons could kind of do that, where you could kind of feel the edges, or like you could kind of feel where they couldn't quite make it. And sometimes those failures are the things that kind of allow this a little bit of digital analog to kind of exist. And it's been a really, really amazing kind of process to see how these things kind of function, how it's influenced all of the other facets of my kind of art direction and animation experience. Now coming back to this like more well-rounded kind of fundamental base. I hope at the end of all this, there's a couple points that might be useful for you moving forward. Thank you so much for joining me, and really excited to see what you all make out there. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.